transaction happened in the unsparing light of a Texas morning, September 14, 1858, on the dusty grounds of the Anderson County Courthouse in Palestine. The air, thick with humidity and the scent of horses, seemed to crackle with the tension of the gathered crowd. James Henry Garrett, a man whose ambition was stitched into the very fabric of his fine woolen coat, stood facing Silas Beaumont, the horse trader whose lean frame and weathered face spoke of long trails and hard bargains. Between them stood the object of their exchange, though few in the stunned crowd would have described her as such. She was Delilah May Garrett, James's wife, a woman of considerable size and, until this moment, of invisible spirit. With a hand that did not tremble, James signed the papers that dissolved his marriage and transferred custody of his wife to Beaumont. In return, Beaumont handed over the lead rope of a magnificent Morgan stallion, its coat the color of polished mahogany, its value set at $600. The crowd, expecting a scandal, a protest, any shred of human drama, was met instead with a chilling civility. Delilah May signed her own name with a quiet finality, her face a mask of unreadable calm, while the two men completed their business as if trading bales of cotton. They did not know that they were witnessing not a mere scandal, but the first move in a meticulously plotted revenge. Silas Beaumont had not sought this trade out of opportunity or perverse desire. He had engineered it as a calculated retaliation for a public insult, and the vengeance he would exact in the months to come would not be swift and violent, but slow and insidious, methodically dismantling every pillar of the life James Henry Garrett held dear. The town of Palestine in 1858 was a place where prosperity and propriety were two sides of the same coin. Nestled on the vital trade route between Houston and the Red River, it thrived on cotton and timber, its 2,000 souls serviced by 3 cotton gins, 2 banks, and a courthouse of imported limestone that stood as a testament to its aspirations. Here wealth was measured in acreage and enslaved workers, and social standing was a currency as tangible as gold. The Garrett family occupied a respectable tier in this rigid hierarchy. James had inherited 400 acres of prime bottomland and a dozen enslaved workers from his father, and through shrewd management and relentless ambition, he had expanded his holdings to 600 acres and his workforce to 18. He was a fixture at the Methodist Church, the treasurer of the Agricultural Association, and a man who wore his desire for entry into the county's uppermost echelon like a second skin. His wife, Delilah May, had been born a Thornton of Crockett, and their marriage 7 years prior had been hailed as an advantageous union. She brought a substantial dowry and the refined skills of an educated woman. She could read French and play the piano, while he offered the solid foundation of land and legacy. But the handsome couple the wedding guests had admired soon frayed at the seams. The stillborn twins they lost in their second year of marriage plunged Delilah May into a profound melancholy from which she never fully emerged. She retreated from society, her world shrinking to the confines of her parlor and her bedroom, where servants brought trays of food that became her solitary comfort. Her body expanded, reaching 347 pounds, becoming a subject of relentless gossip not just for its size, but for what it represented. A failure of James's household management, a visible flaw in his meticulously constructed facade. In the smoky back rooms of agricultural meetings fortified by bourbon, James's frustration would spill out. He spoke of the burden of a wife who gave him no sons, no social advantage, and nothing but a constant, humiliating reminder of a domestic life gone awry. The Thornton dowry was long spent, absorbed into the plantation, and all that remained, in his cold calculation, was a woman who cost him more in food and embarrassment than she was worth. Silas Beaumont was a creature of an entirely different world. A Kentuckian by birth, he had arrived in Texas with a reputation for understanding horseflesh better than he understood people. He operated from a property 5 miles west of town, a sprawling, well-maintained barn, sturdy corrals, and a modest house that served as little more than a way station between his travels. He stood over 6 feet tall, his body lean and hardened by a life spent in the saddle, his voice carrying a slow, deliberate drawl. Unlike the settled planters, Beaumont was perpetually in motion, traversing East Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, his business dealings granting him a unique social latitude. He was as comfortable dining at a planter's table as he was drinking in a disreputable tavern. His reputation was his bond, and it was this reputation that James Garrett had carelessly tarnished. 3 months before the courthouse transaction, James had purchased a young gelding from Beaumont that later revealed a split hoof, expertly concealed. Furious, James had spread word throughout the county of the horse trader's dishonesty, poisoning Beaumont's name among his most lucrative clients. Their confrontation at a summer agricultural meeting was brief and brutal. Surrounded by his peers, James had loudly demanded recompense. Beaumont, standing alone, had replied with cold calm that any man who couldn't properly examine a horse had no business questioning the seller's integrity. "I'll have satisfaction for this insult," James had declared, the code of Southern honor demanding a resolution. "Name your terms." Beaumont's smile was a thin, unsettling line. "I'll consider the matter," he had said, his drawl softening the menace in his words, "and let you know when I've determined what constitutes fair compensation." What followed was a campaign of quiet observation. Throughout August, Beaumont became a student of the Garrett household. He spoke with their servants at the market, visited Delilah May's family in Crockett under false pretenses, and watched from the back row of the Methodist church. He was assembling a portrait of a miserable marriage, a trapped woman, and a vain, vulnerable man. He was not planning a brawl. He was architecting a ruin. The first act of his design unfolded on September 10th, when Beaumont rode up to the Garrett plantation astride the Morgan stallion. The animal was breathtaking, a creature of pure power and breeding, and it immediately captured James's covetous attention. "I'm not here to sell him to you," Beaumont stated, cutting off James's inquiries about price. "I'm here to offer a trade." When James protested he had nothing of equal value, Beaumont replied, "That's a matter of perspective." He reminded James of his challenge to name terms for satisfaction. "I'll trade you this stallion," he said, his gaze drifting toward the house where a curtain twitched in an upstairs window. "In exchange for your wife." The words hung in the air, monstrous and absurd. James cycled through shock, anger, and then a slow dawning calculation. He sputtered about the illegality, the insanity, but Beaumont was prepared, having already consulted with Judge Patterson. He spoke of creative paperwork, of transferring custody, of mutual agreement. He presented the transaction not as a crime, but as a solution, freedom from a burdensome marriage and a valuable asset to show for it. He appealed to James's deepest desires, social advancement and liberation from humiliation. Most crucially, he expressed a chilling confidence that Delilah May would consent. What transpired inside the house during the private conversation between Beaumont and Delilah May remained a mystery, but when they emerged, she had agreed. 4 days later, before a stunned crowd at the courthouse, the papers were signed and notarized. James rode away on the Morgan without a backward glance. Beaumont helped Delilah May into his wagon and drove west, leaving behind a town buzzing with a scandal it could not quite comprehend. The 5-mile journey to Beaumont's property was a silent passage from one life into another. Delilah May, her hands folded in her lap, watched the familiar landscape roll by, seeing it now through the eyes of a woman who had been legally bartered. Yet beneath the numbness, a fragile ember of agency, long extinguished, began to glow. Beaumont's proposal, delivered with brutal honesty in her parlor 4 days prior, had not been a romantic overture, but a business proposition. He needed a manager for his household and business affairs. She possessed the education and intelligence for the task. "You'll work, Mrs. Garrett," he had said. "You'll be useful. That's more than your current situation provides." For a woman who had been treated as a decorative, broken object, the offer was a lifeline. Beaumont's property was a reflection of the man. Functional, orderly, and devoid of frivolity. The house was sparse, but the barn was impeccable. Abraham, the older black man who cooked and kept the house, greeted her with a neutral dignity that held no judgment. Over the next few hours, Delilah May saw the truth of Beaumont's words. His operation was successful but chaotic, plagued by disorganized ledgers, piled-up correspondence, and domestic disorder. Here was a purpose. She set to work with a ferocity that surprised even herself. She implemented systems for record-keeping, renegotiated contracts with suppliers, reorganized the household, and established proper routines. The physical activity, combined with the mental engagement and the simple dignity of useful work, began to transform her. The weight, both physical and emotional, began to lift. She discovered an innate talent for the business side of horse trading, her analytical mind perfectly suited to tracking bloodlines and market opportunities. The arrangement that had begun as Beaumont's revenge was evolving into a genuine partnership. Meanwhile, Palestine society clucked and whispered, but James Garrett, now possessing the magnificent Morgan stallion, found his social standing oddly intact, the scandal absorbed by the town's collective desire for propriety. But James watched Beaumont's operation flourish with a growing, venomous rage. The courthouse transaction, which he had believed would rid him of a burden, had instead gifted his enemy with the very capabilities he had dismissed. When he visited Beaumont's property to offer a financial reversal of the deal, he was met with a cold, unified refusal from both Beaumont and Delilah May. "I prefer useful work to decorative confinement," she told him, her voice steady and sure. The humiliation curdled into a cold, determined hatred. James's campaign shifted from social pressure to covert violence. First came the whispered rumors meant to poison Beaumont's business relationships. Then a letter to Delilah May's family in Crockett, painting her situation as one of coercion and scandal, forcing her to choose between her new life and her family of origin. She chose her freedom, penning a detailed letter that resulted in her family formally disowning her. The loss was a sharp pain, but it was a clean cut, severing her from a past that had already forsaken her. The violence escalated from rumor to fire. On a night when Beaumont was away, James hired men to set the barn ablaze. Delilah May, Abraham, and the two handlers, the Yarrow brothers, fought the inferno, but they could not save the barn or the 3 priceless horses trapped inside. The sheriff declared it arson, but had no proof to connect it to James. Beaumont returned to ashes and ruin, his face a mask of cold fury. The financial damage was immense, but the message was clear. James would destroy what he could not reclaim. In the aftermath, while sifting through Beaumont's old correspondence, Delilah May made a discovery that reframed their entire history. She found a letter from Beaumont to a Kentucky breeder, dated weeks before their public dispute, in which he described James Garrett as a difficult customer to be avoided. The defective horse, the public confrontation, it had all been a deliberate setup. Beaumont had engineered the entire chain of events to maneuver James into a position where this specific, humiliating trade would be his only perceived path to satisfaction. "You manipulated both of us," she accused him that evening. "I created an opportunity," he corrected, his gaze level. "You chose to take it." The revelation was staggering, yet it changed nothing about their present reality. They were partners in a besieged enterprise, facing an enemy who would not stop. The final brutal confirmation came when 3 of their prized breeding mares were found poisoned. The war was now total. It was Delilah May who devised their counterstroke. 7 years of marriage had given her access to James's deepest secrets. She knew he had illegally purchased enslaved workers from the banned African trade through Louisiana intermediaries, a crime that would destroy him socially and legally. She had kept the documentation as insurance. Now it would be their weapon. Beaumont sent a letter to James, detailing their knowledge and delivering a simple ultimatum: cease all attacks, or the information would be delivered to federal marshals and every newspaper in Texas. The threat worked. The attack ceased. A fragile, tense stalemate settled over Anderson County. The Civil War came and went, reshaping the world around them. James Garrett remarried and faded into a diminished, cautious version of his former self, forever looking over his shoulder. Delilah May, no longer under any man's custody but her own, flourished as Beaumont's business partner, and a respected, if unconventional, figure in the county. The partnership born of revenge and manipulation had, through shared struggle and mutual respect, solidified into something enduring and genuine. The Morgan Stallion lived out its days in James's paddock, a beautiful, unused trophy to a transaction that had broken him and freed her. The leather-bound deed and Delilah May's own journal, preserved in the County Historical Society, tell the story of a woman who was traded as property and, from that impossible position, built a life of purpose, power, and hard-won independence. It was the most shocking transaction in Texas history, not for its cruelty, but for the unexpected liberation that grew, like a stubborn wildflower, from its barren and unforgiving soil.